Do they need to provide you with a free method of access to communication so you can speak to someone on the other side? If it's going to be more than 4 hours, do they need to provide you with refreshment?
But you say it's already in force, it's already in operation. So
yes.
What do they need to do if there's that kind of delay?
What the airlines need to do, for instance, if there's going to be a delay immediately after the window,
that 15-minute window.
Yes, is to announce and let the passengers know that the flight is delayed. After about an hour, if it's going to be, and then they should say exactly how much time they expect the delay to be, and to the extent possible and acceptable, they should also identify the reason for the delay. Of course, there are some delays which you cannot specifically state the exact reason. So, for instance, if it's a weather delay, they should be able to say to passengers that there's going to be a delay because of the weather. And some of the delays and cancellations, which passengers would ordinarily go after airlines about, are exempted. I mean, for something like weather, the airlines, it's also in the best interest of passengers not to operate in difficult weather. So the airlines will not necessarily have liability when the basis of the delay is something that is understood to be acceptable.
Okay, moving away from delay, something I witnessed at the airport. A young man had his ticket, but according to the operators, he came in after they had closed the counter.
Correct.
But by the time he came, they were selling tickets to people, but he had his own ticket and they refused to let him board.
Well, I mean, that also is a subject of regulation in the sense that the regulation, the airlines have the prerogative to say, look, this is the time of the flight, and this is the time check-in would end. This is the time the counter closes. It's only fair because they need to prepare the flight. They need to deploy their resources in different ways between arrival, departure, and ticketing. They need to close a flight, essentially. There's baggage to be moved, and then there are security issues. Going through security takes some time now, and then there's a gate closing. So the airlines do have the prerogative and absolutely the right to determine at what point, so long as it's reasonable when the counter closes. And when you've said that, if you arrive after that, then the airlines reserve the right not to check you in.
Even when they are still selling tickets to some other people?
What I'm concerned about is the selling tickets to some other people. Well, this is tenuous. I don't know exactly what happened in that situation. But ordinarily, if the check-in counter has closed, it means that nobody else can check in on that flight. So I don't see any reason why they would be selling tickets at that point. And my question would be, if this is a revenue issue and all the airline wants to make his money, why would it not check in a passenger who has a ticket on that flight? Remember that the airline seat is a very perishable item.
Yeah.
The moment that flight departs, that ticket that is sold to you, they've lost that money. So it is in their interest. Even if they're going to charge you an extra in the future to carry you, it's still another perishable item.
But would that regulation cover that kind of scenario? Because this was a real-life incident. I was standing there. I was on another queue, and I was standing there watching this go on.
Certainly, I think it would be an unfair practice in the sense that what would have happened is if this really occurred in the manner that you said, that was discriminatory conduct. That means that particular passenger was discriminated against in preference for some other passengers who were purchasing tickets at the time he was trying to check in. So if that occurred, yes, certainly it's conduct that should be penalized.
And this will be applicable to foreign and local airlines, both for international and domestic flights?
That is correct, so long as the flights originate or terminate in Nigeria or within Nigeria.
What about their members of staff? I mean, do they have adequate training or knowledge of all of this to ensure that they comply with these provisions?
Well, organizations understand that when the laws or the regulations change, they're going to do some internal training and all that. I suspect many of them already know this, and for those who don't, I'm sure that they would provide the appropriate training to their employees.
But I think I heard you talking about if you're at a point you're talking about providing refreshments when you're being attended to. What was that part about?
Well, what it is that after a certain, if the delay is going to be for a certain extended period of time, the airlines have an obligation to provide refreshment to the passengers.
Is it stipulated in that?
It is stipulated. It is stipulated.
So,
and it says that
the letter, details?
Yes, the regulations are sufficiently detailed, and then after a certain, I mean, if it's going to be a 6-hour wait, they have an obligation to provide a rest area or, hotel accommodation, especially in the case of cancellations or delays that are going to be very extended.
Don't you think that some of these airlines might say or be of the opinion that, isn't this telling us how to run our business?
But that's exactly what regulations are about. Tell you how to operate your business. Yeah, I mean, and they're very important. In any case, the way they operate their business now is based on regulation. Who can be a captain is not entirely up to them. It's by regulation. Whether that captain, whether the pilot has a license, who can even be in the cabin as a member of your crew. There are regulations about heights and all kinds of things. So, I mean, the airlines are very used to I suppose aviation is actually one of the most regulated industries in the world. But a consumer protection regulation, we must understand that it's actually a great thing. Oh. I come from the consumer rights advocacy constituency, okay. And I give the Civil Aviation Authority and the aviation authorities an incredible amount of credit for developing these regulations and staying the focus and the commitment to enforcing them.
So this also talks about how they need to conduct themselves even when the flight is airborne.
Certainly. I mean, if a passenger is displeased with the quality of the service while in flight, it's a subject of regulation. For instance, I mean, if you pick passengers up and then you treat them in a discourteous manner, and they have a right to complain about that. And there are provisions in the regulations that will consider that. But remember but it's not, I mean, the regulations protect everybody. The way it is that where there are no regulations, everything is very subjective. Yeah. And so passengers can pursue airlines for literally anything. But the regulations really identify what really becomes a violation of the law, in which case passengers are protected and airlines are also protected.
But from the look of things now, yes, we make some of these laws, but there's always a big question mark: enforcement. Don't you see a challenge with enforcement of this?
Well, enforcement of laws is a worldwide challenge. I think it's so much more so in Nigeria than it is in many other parts, but enforcement is always a question everywhere. And that's why I think and I've been monitoring this quite a bit, that there is a campaign to bring these regulations right there to the front burner so the airlines know the enforcement will start. And so the passengers also recognize their rights. Just that whole awareness itself is an enforcement initiative, because when people know their rights, you're halfway to ensuring that those rights are respected.
Are they going to set up a new enforcement board, or is the same ones that exist? Because the same ones that exist, there was always this question of confidence that passengers have in them, because they complained severally, nothing was done.
Well, I mean, the Civil Aviation Authority has a Consumer Protection Directorate. I know that they're doing an incredible amount of work with respect to enforcement, and I know that there's been recent hiring and training that's ongoing, which we have participated in, to ensure that they have a robust enforcement program.
So they will be the ones enforcing this? For
the most part, they expect the airlines to resolve the complaints that passengers have. So it's not like the airlines are removed. The airlines themselves really want to respond as best as they can. The biggest part of this is letting them understand that there's a regulatory framework and there's a violation of law when this happens. So I expect that most people will still complain to the airline and have a lot of their complaints resolved at that point. But what cannot be resolved between the airline and the passenger, I expect that the Civil Aviation Authority will take that on and certainly pursue the enforcement.
Okay, would there be any such thing as the time limits with which they have to attend to some of these complaints?
Without question. What would happen is that if a complaint if ultimately an unresolved complaint comes to the Civil Aviation Authority, they would obviously contact the airline and say, here's what the complaint is. We require a response within, maybe 7 days. And then after that, they would make a decision one way or the other what their thoughts are. I suspect most of the decisions would also be having the both of them talk and see if there's some kind of a middle ground. And where there's no middle ground, the Civil Aviation Authority would certainly impose whatever appropriate penalty it thinks.
I'm sorry to ask you. The question will now be the bureaucratic bottlenecks that will be between from the time a complaint is made by a passenger, or how many passengers will need to complain before something is done?
I think that every single complaint will be taken on its own merit, so it's not going to be a bunch of complaints before anything is done. And yes, the bottlenecks, the bureaucracy does exist, but from what I have heard, the Consumer Protection Directorate of the Civil Aviation Authority is actually handling somewhere between 15 to 20,000 complaints per month and resolving